All right, I'm going to be reading chapters 7, 8, and 9 today from George's Secret Key to the Universe. Don't forget that there are questions on Google Docs that I emailed to you. You don't have to do them, but it's just kind of something to do as we are learning from home. Chapter 7. The way home from school was long and hot. The unexpected heat of the early autumn sun was beating down on the asphalt, turning it soft and squishy under George's feet. He trudged along the pavement while big cars whizzed past him, leaving smelly fumes behind them as he went. In some of these enormous, shiny monsters sat the smug kids from school, watching DVDs in the back seat as their parents drove home. Some of them made faces at George as they drove past, jeering at him for having to walk. Others waved happily as though he would somehow be pleased to see them as they shot off into the distance in their vast gas guzzlers. No one ever stopped and offered him a lift. But today, he didn't mind. He had plenty to think about on his walk home, and he felt glad to be alone. His mind was full of clouds in space, huge explosions, and the millions of years it took to make a star. These thoughts took him far, far across the universe. So far, in fact, that he completely forgot an important fact about life on planet Earth. "Hey," he heard a shout from behind, and it snapped him back into the here and now. He hoped it was just someone shouting in the street, a random noise that had nothing to do with him. He hurried along a little faster, clutching his school bag snugly to his chest. "Hey," he heard again, this time a little closer. Resisting the urge to look back, he sped up his pace. On one side of him was the busy main road, on the other side the city park, which offered nowhere to hide. The trees were too thin and scraggly to stand behind, and going anywhere near the bushes was a bad idea. The last thing he wanted was to get dragged into them by the boys he feared were behind him. He kept going, getting faster every minute, his heartbeat thumping in his chest like a bongo drum. "Georgie boy," he heard the yell, and his blood curdled. All his worst fears were confirmed. Usually, when the end of school bell rang, George shot out of the gates and was well on his way home while the larger, slower boys were still flicking rubber bands at each other in the coat room. He'd heard the awful stories of what Ringo and his followers did to the kids they caught on the street. Eyebrows shaved off, hung upside down, covered in mud, left up a tree wearing only underwear, painted in indelible ink, or abandoned to take the blame for broken windows. All were whispered tales at school of Ringo's reign of terror. But on that sunny, drowsy autumn afternoon, George had made a terrible mistake. He was walking home too slowly just when he'd given Ringo and his friends a reason to come looking for him. Angry with him for landing them with extra work in Greeper's class, they were now clearly on his tail and ready to take revenge. George looked around. Ahead of him, he saw a group of mothers pushing carriages toward an intersection where a crossing guard stopped the traffic to let people across. Scurried forward, he joined the moms and babies, managing to insert himself into their midst so that he was surrounded by strollers. Ambling across the road while the crossing guard held up her bright yellow sign, George tried to look as though he belonged to one of the mother and baby groups, but he knew he wasn't fooling anyone. As he passed the crossing guard, she winked at him and said under her breath, "Don't worry, dear, I'll hold him back for you for a minute. But you run along now and get home. Don't let those nasty boys catch you." When George reached the other side of the road, to his surprise, the crossing guard leaned her sign against a tree and stood there glaring back at Ringo and his friends. The roar of the traffic started up again, and as George sped away, he heard another menacing shout. "Hey, we got to get across. We need to get home and do our schoolwork. If you don't let us cross, I'll tell my mother and she'll come straighten you out." "You watch yourself, Richard Bright," grumbled the crossing guard, walking slowly out into the road with her sign. George turned off the main road, but the sound of heavy thudding feet behind him told him they knew which way he'd gone. He was hurrying down a long tree-lined alley that ran behind the gardens of some very big houses. For once, it was empty of adults who might have saved him. George tried a few of the doors in the fences, but they were all firmly locked. He looked around in a panic and then had a flash of inspiration. Grabbing onto the lowest bough of an overhanging apple tree, He hoisted himself high enough to gain a foothold on the top of the fence and leaped right over it. He landed in a large prickly bush which scratched him, ripping his school uniform. As he lay groaning silently in the shrubbery, he heard Ringo and his friends pass by on the other side of the fence, making spine-chilling comments about what they'd do to George when they got their hands on him. George stayed until he was sure they'd gone, wriggled free of his school sweater, which was hopelessly tangled in the spiky bush. He struggled out of the clinging branches. His pant pockets had emptied their contents onto the ground. He scrabbled around trying to pick up all of his important things. Then he emerged from the undergrowth onto a long, flat green lawn where a very surprised lady lay in a deck chair sunbathing. She lifted up her dark glasses and looked at him. "Bonjour," she said in a nice voice. She pointed toward the house. "Go that way. The gate is not so locked." "Oh, merci," said George, remembering his one word of French. And, he added as he rushed past her and ran along the passage by the side of her house. He went through the gate, came out into the road, and set off for home, limping a little because he'd twisted his left foot. The streets were quiet and sleepy as he hobbled along, but the silence didn't last long. "There he is!" A great cry went up. "Georgie boy," he heard, "we're coming to get you." George gathered the last of his strength and tried to get his legs to move fast, but he felt as though he were wading through quicksand. He wasn't far from home and he could see the end of his road, but Ringo and his gang were gaining on him. He plowed bravely forward, reaching the corner just as he thought he might collapse on the pavement. "We're going to kill you," Ringo shouted from behind him. Staggering, George tottered down his street. His breath had gone all funny. The air was going in and out of his lungs in great swooshing gasps. All the scratches and bruises and bumps he'd gotten running away from Ringo were hurting. His throat was parched and he was exhausted. He could have gone much further, but he didn't need to. He was home. He'd reached the green front door without being turned into ground meat or something worse by Ringo and his terrible friends. And now everything was going to be all right. All he had to do was reach into his pocket and find his key to unlock the front door. But it wasn't there. He turned out his pockets and found all of his treasures, a marble, a Spanish coin, a length of string, a model red sports car, and a ball of fluff, but no key. He must have dropped it in the bushes when he climbed over the fence. He rang the bell, hoping his mom might have come home early. Ting-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling. He tried again, but there was still no answer. Seeing him standing there, Ringo realized he'd won. He plastered a hideous smile on his face and started to saunter confidently toward George. Behind him, eager for trouble, came his 3 weasel-faced, hard-knuckled friends. George knew there was nowhere left to run. He closed his eyes and stood with his back in his front door, his stomach churning as he prepared to meet his fate. He tried to think of something to say that might make Ringo back off, but he couldn't come up with anything clever, and there wasn't much point in telling Ringo he was going to get in trouble. Ringo knew that already, and it had never stopped him before. The footsteps stopped, and George opened one eye to see what was happening. Ringo and his friends had paused halfway down the path and were having some kind of conference about what to do with George. "No," Ringo was saying loudly, "that's ridiculous. Let's squeeze him against the wall until he begs us to let him go." But just as Ringo spoke, something happened, something so peculiar that afterward, Ringo and his friends weren't sure if they'd dreamed it. The door of the house next to George's flew open, and out of it bounded what looked like a tiny astronaut. Everyone took a step back in astonishment as the small figure in a white spacesuit with round glass helmet and an antenna attached to the back jumped into the middle of the road, striking a fierce karate-style pose. "Get back," said the spacesuit in a strange metallic voice, "or I will put the curse of alien life on you. You will turn green, and your brains will bubble and leak out of your ears and down your nose. Your bones will turn into rubber, and you will grow hundreds of warts all over your body. You will only be able to eat spinach and broccoli, and you will never, ever be able to watch television again because it will make your eyes fall out of your head." So there, the astronaut did a few twirls and kicks that looked somehow familiar to George. Ringo and his friends had turned a ghostly color and were stumbling backward, their mouths hanging open. They were absolutely terrified. "Get into the house," said the spacesuit to George. George slipped into next door's house. He wasn't scared of the little astronaut. He'd caught a gleam of bright blonde hair through the glass of the helmet, It looked like Annie had saved him. Chapter 8. Whew! The figure in the spacesuit followed George into the house, slamming the front door with a backward kick of a hefty space boot. "It's hot in here," it added, pulling off the round glass helmet and flipping out a long ponytail. It was Annie, a bit pink in the face from jumping about in the heavy suit. "Did you see how scared they were?" she said to George, beaming and wiping her forehead on her sleeve. "Did you?" She strode along the hallway, making clunking noises as she walked. "Come on." Yes, thank you," George managed to say as he trailed behind her into the same room where he'd watched the birth and death of a star with Eric. He'd been so excited about coming back to see Cosmos again, but now he just felt miserable. He accidentally told horrible Dr. Reaper about Cosmos when he promised Eric he would keep it a secret. He'd had a long, frightening journey back from school being chased by the bullies, and to cap it off, he'd been rescued by a little girl wearing a spacesuit. It was turning out to be a really bad day. Annie, on the other hand, seemed to be enjoying herself immensely. "What do you think?" she said to George, smoothing down the brilliant white folds of her jumpsuit. "It's new. It just arrived in the mail." On the floor lay a cardboard box covered in stamps marked "Space Adventures Are Us." Next to it was a much smaller pink suit with sequins, badges, and space ribbon sewn all over it. It was dirty and worn and covered in patches. "That's my old suit," Annie explained. "I had that when I was really young," she said scornfully. "I thought it was cool to put all that stuff on it, but now I like my spacesuits plain." "Why have you got a spacesuit?" asked George. "Are you going to a costume party?" "As if," Annie rolled her eyes. "Cosmos," she called. "Yes, Annie, this is Cosmos the computer fondly." "You good, beautiful, lovely, wonderful computer." "Oh, Annie," said Cosmos, his screen glowing as if he were blushing. "George wants to know why I have a spacesuit." "Annie has a spacesuit," replied Cosmos, "so she can go on journeys around outer space. It's very cold out there, around minus 455 degrees Fahrenheit. She would freeze solid in a fraction of a second if she didn't wear it." "Yeah, but," protested George, but he didn't get far. "I go on journeys around the solar system with my dad," boasted Annie. "Sometimes my mom comes too, but she really doesn't like it in outer space." George felt really fed up. He was in no mood for silly games. "No, you don't," he said crossly. "You don't go into outer space. You'd have to go up in a space shuttle to do that, and they're never going to let you on board because they wouldn't know what was true and what you'd make up." Annie's mouth had formed a perfect O. "You just tell stupid stories about your ballerina or an astronaut, and your dad and Cosmos pretend to believe you, but they don't. Really," George continued, who was hot and tired and wanted to have something good to eat. Annie blinked rapidly. Her blue eyes were suddenly very shiny and full of tears. "I'm not making it up," she said furiously, her round cheeks turning even pinker. I'm not. It's all true. Don't tell stories. I am a ballerina, and I do go into outer space. And I'm going to show you." She stomped over to Cosmos, and she went on angrily. "You're going to come too, and that way you'll believe me." She rummaged in a shipping box and brought out another suit, which she threw at George. "Put that on," she commanded. "Uh-oh," said Cosmos quietly. Annie was standing in front of Cosmos, drumming her fingers on the keyboard. "Where should I take him?" she asked. "I don't think this is a good idea," warned Cosmos.